Hi, welcome to the mini lecture on Chapter 1, which is about the history of the world system. So before we get into the history, I wanted to review the concepts of empirical and normative. Normative inquiry, as you were introduced last week, is the basis of these disciplines: ethics, philosophy, political theory, gender and feminist theory, etc. And these types of inquiries tell us how things should be, or they allow us to explore this question of how should things be? What ought the world to look like? And these are some examples of questions that somebody might ask when they're engaged in normative inquiry. So how does this work with world politics? We take a puzzle, and we'll be working with different types of puzzles throughout the semester. The first one is, why have resource-rich countries fallen so far behind industrial states since World War II? And here we can identify the factors when we engage in empirical inquiry that might lead to us finding an answer. So we gather data, we get information on what we think drives a country's level of wealth. And we could use statistical analysis, specifically a regression, to figure out what factors influence a country's level of wealth today. And we can incorporate a lot of history in this as well. So we can look at their level of democracy, their colonial history, geography, war, debt, natural resources, human rights, rule of law, education, gender, health, infrastructure, etc. And through looking at all these things, we can come up with some ways to measure how influential these factors are in determining a country's level of wealth today. The normative inquiry associated with this, though, looks at different questions. So a question about this, whether or why have resource-rich countries fallen behind? One question might be, should those countries be pressured to adopt democratic reforms when they receive a loan from the World Bank or countries or other organizations? Or should poor countries with abundant natural resources be given better terms of trade when they sell those resources to wealthier states? And I gave you another example below here of another type of puzzle that you can look at, and we will be looking at when we get to our section on rule of law and governance. So why are there so few women who have served as heads of state? So we can go about it by asking this type of empirical inquiry, as well as some big questions that we can ask about, well, how should the world look? Should we introduce quotas for women in parliament? Should we have countries be pressured through various mechanisms to increase funding for education? So I will give you guys a link to this intellectual humility test in Blackboard, so check that out when you're done with the lecture. So our agenda for the chapter and what I'll focus on today is number 1, cooperation through history. That's the lens through which we'll look at these different time periods. Cooperation means whether countries are getting along, are working together in terms of interacting with each other in the world system, or are they at war with each other. We'll also look at these key time periods today. And again, your chapter is quite lengthy, but it's giving you the basics of each of these time periods. And the key things to know are what the chapter highlights in terms of what was going on more generally, who were the key players, who were the winners, who were those who were definitely not winning, who were the losers of the different types of systems, and what that has done to shift the trajectory of the current world system. And then finally, what will shape our world in the future. So let's start with this question of yes or no. Has cooperation among states increased linearly over time? The answer is definitely not. We have some level of cooperation by some states that is up here early on, but there are a whole number of states during that time period, in fact, most pieces of land, most groups of people, who were not participating at all in that world system. And then you have World War I, World War II, and then today, do we see more cooperation? Are we cooperating more? There are some measures that can tell us whether the answer is yes-ish or no-ish, but it's definitely been more like this rather than a linear path. So let's look at cooperation through history and the truth. Starting out with this puzzle, why have some eras been relatively peaceful and prosperous, whereas others have been filled with violent conflict? So the summary is that in the 1800s, we have relative peace and prosperity, but only for a particular group of countries. So while there was one group that was experiencing this relative peace and prosperity, they were the perpetrators of a colonial world where you had the peace and prosperity stemming directly from their colonial rule over other lands and over other people. So you have an increase or a continuation of slavery during this time period. And then this scramble for Africa, where colonial states started staking their claim over the people and land in that continent, that actually did not get started in earnest until the end of the 1800s and really the beginning of the 1900s. So you see the map of the continent of Africa change most in the 1900s. That's not that long ago. And it's important to remember that the colonial past of many states in this system or countries in this system was not in the 1500s. It really went all the way up until the 1900s. So the second time period in the 1900s, we do have wars and economic crises and depressions among the wealthy states from the 1800s, so AKA our colonial powers, and some other newly independent states as well. And then we have in the late 1900s, economic globalization. And then today, since the 2000s, or in the 2000s, there's been this mix of integration and conflict where we've had the growth of Brazil, Russia, China, etc. And they've been integrated to some degree, and you still have the continuation of both violent and nonviolent conflict as well. So we'll start off looking at time period number 1. This is the mercantilist era, starting in 1492 and ending around 1815. And this was the birth and growth of the colonial powers. So we have Columbus from Spain, Henry the Navigator from Portugal, traveling the world, and they were the first to expand and establish colonies abroad. So I do want to take a moment to define mercantilism as a concept. It's an economic doctrine. It is based on the idea that military and economic power are equal. You are only as powerful as your military, and your economic power is there to support your military. And the idea is that states have a choice between guns and butter. And here, every country has a budget. And when they make choices about that budget, they choose between the military and social services. And in a mercantilist system, states or countries are more likely to choose military over social systems or butter. So you have an emphasis of guns over butter. And you have an emphasis on what we call relative power, or a system of relative gains. And this is in opposition to absolute power or gains. And let's talk about that concept now. So let's look at this simple exercise. If you could select either of these scenarios or options for the year 2021, which would you choose? Option 1 has the US increasing their GDP by 5% and China increasing by 10%. Number 2 is that the US increases by 2% and then China increases by 3%. So I'll give you a moment to decide which one you'd choose. So with the relative gains view, countries see wealth as pie, literally pie. So here, if you've got the US, China, and then we'll use ROW for rest of the world. If the United States has a certain percent of the world's wealth, and if the United States is concerned about the relative position of itself vis-a-vis China, it's going to view the world system in this is the relative gains, or we call it a zero-sum approach. It's zero-sum because there's nothing for anybody overall to gain. They're all stuck in this piece of pie, where the total piece of pie is unchanging. So if the United States wants more income, then it would have to take it away from the rest of the world or China. Again, this is a zero-sum approach. The opposite approach is an absolute gains approach. And this approach, and I'm drawing it on the back on purpose, this approach sees time, and I'll put wealth over here, as a chart where you can go up, maybe you go down, but then other countries can take their own path. But if you notice, there is nothing stopping everybody in this approach from increasing at the ends. So everybody can be better off down here. And again, this is the absolute gains or a non-zero-sum approach. So a non-zero-sum approach, again, sees the world like a chart where everybody can go up. It doesn't assume that everybody will go up, but it assumes that you could go up, versus the zero-sum approach, or relative gains, that views the world as pie. And the mercantilist system basically viewed the world as pie, where colonial powers were vying against each other in competition for the wealth that they saw through natural resources and human capital in the form of slaves around the rest of the world. That also captures the different views of many people today as well. So it's a useful concept not just in mercantilism, but in other time periods, including the modern day world system. The mercantilist era was dominated by controls on trade because of this competition. This is an example of how that might have happened. And of course, this is a big part of the American story. This table shows what you can learn when you quantify the costs and benefits of mercantilism. So this table looks at the 13 colonies in the early United States between the time period of 1763 to 1772. The biggest benefit to the 13 colonies was military protection, and the biggest losses were economic. And the biggest losers specifically were tobacco and rice planters in Virginia and North Carolina, and craftsmen and merchants in New England. So when you understand the story of economics during this time period, specifically trade, you do get a much better picture of the economic story of the American Revolution. Another key time period in the mercantilist era, or another key event, was the 30 Years' War, and specifically what ended that war, which is the Peace of Westphalia, or what we know of today as the Treaty of Westphalia. And the 30 Years' War marked the decline of Spain and the rise of France, the Dutch, and others. And the end of it, the most important piece of this slide in this section, is to understand the concept of sovereignty. So the Peace of Westphalia came about through the treaty that established sovereignty and non-interference for countries at the time. What this means is that starting in 1648, countries have sovereignty and other entities do not. So that gives countries the right and authority to control what happens within their borders. And this concept of non-interference is that other countries cannot interfere in each other's affairs, mainly borders. Today that's expanded a little bit, but the concept is really established around borders, political, physical borders. So after 1648, we see countries becoming supreme. This is important to understand because the sovereignty of states was formed through the consent of states. And that consent was formed through international law, through this Treaty of Westphalia. There was nothing that was bound to happen. There was no sort of origin story that countries were always going to come to be, and therefore they were. Really, it was that political entities were at war, and those who won the war decided to give themselves sovereignty. It's a pretty clear story. So towards the end of the mercantilist era, Spain's defeat really ended with this 150-year time period with England and France fighting each other through this series of wars that you see on your screen. And eventually, who won? It was Britain. So this challenge between England and France led to Britain becoming what we call the hegemon. The hegemon, or the fight for hegemony, is about the dominant world power. So today we would say the United States is continuing in its position of the hegemon, but we don't know for certain if that will continue for much longer. So we have questions about American hegemony today. That's how you pronounce it, and again, it describes who the current superworld power is. So the summary of the mercantilist era is that the interests were of dominant states, that was security through power, the control of markets and resources, that's what they wanted, and to go on civilizing missions. Of course, we know that means slavery and taking away of natural resources. Their interactions were zero-sum bargaining, a subjugation of colonies, and the institutions at the time were empires. So they formed large empires. There was no other type of cooperation. Time period number 2 is Pax Britannica, between 1815 and 1914, and this is the 100 Years' Peace. The sources of cooperation were that there was a convergence of interest and British hegemony and dominance through naval power and colonialism. So you can see through this graph that mercantilism was very costly, and then wealth increased almost immediately after it ended. So you see wealth starts to jump in the 1800s. Pax Britannica saw the gold standard that promotes stability and predictability. But there are some requirements that you need to know about. So the gold standard is not a viable system for today. Why? It has to have 100% convertibility to cash at all times. This means that if you walk into a bank with a certain chunk of gold, they would immediately have to give you that amount of cash. So banks would always have to be able to convert gold into the amount of cash available. There's also a fixed exchange rate of gold to cash. So if it's fixed at 1 ounce equals $100, then that's what it is. And if people find more gold, that's going to lead to problems with getting the price right or getting the value of the cash right. So that would lead to serious imbalances around the world. So this is a map that shows you the colonial empires as of 1914. And I mentioned before the scramble for Africa was really in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and you start to see that happening here with the different labels of who owned the land at the time, whether it was still under local rule or not. So the summary of Pax Britannica, the interests were gaining economic wealth through trade and investment. Interactions were about informal diplomacy. So there was a lot more cooperation in security and economic affairs. And then the institutions were the British hegemony and the concert of Europe. And then the gold standard free trade agreements and economic security were other institutions, paving the way for more peace during this time period. So this third time period is the 30 Years Crisis, which basically marks, as you can see from the years 1914 to 45, the 2 world wars in the 1900s. So you have the Pax Britannica relative time period of peace, again, only for those countries that were wealthy and mostly colonizers. Those alliances really splintered, and then Europe divides into these 2 camps of the Central and Allied powers. These maps are a really good way to understand this time period. So in 1914, at the beginning of World War I, you have empires still. You have Austria-Hungary here. You have Turkey. You can see a little bit of Northern Africa. And then France here, Germany. These are quite large swaths of land, as you can tell, central, allied, and then neutral up here. So this looks a lot different than the map of Europe that we know today. So you can start to see in 1920 some carving out of this map. So when you click in between, when you click in between the two maps, so we no longer have Austria-Hungary. Romania is larger. We have Switzerland here, Luxembourg, Belgium. Again, it's starting to look a lot more like what we know of today. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania up here. We have Northern Ireland, the Irish Free State after 1922. So you see new states replacing the old empires. The Treaty of Versailles after World War I is probably the most important to know in terms of the interwar time period. So the Treaty of Versailles ends World War I. It punishes Germany as the aggressor. Germany is humiliated and loses status and territory, and the requirement for Germany to pay reparations and to recover from its debt cripple the German economy. Hyperinflation happens at the same time, so the Deutschmark is basically worthless at this time period. At the same time, you have economies in Europe and North America, other than Germany. You have tensions that are getting in the way of trade. So Germany is suffering hyperinflation. You have here a German kid playing with bundles of Deutschmarks on the street. The Great Depression also happens in 1929, in part as a trade story. So countries turn inward. The rise of fascism and imperialism is evidenced by Hitler, Mussolini, and the Japanese conquest in Asia. Tensions are increasing in pretty much every sphere of the world, and the United States refuses to join the League of Nations. So that's a story where Senate did not back up the president at the time, and a League of Nations is not successful unless it's universal, as the world system found out, and that's why one of the cornerstones of the United Nations system is for it to be universal. So the United States turns inward, and as we say, after World War I, the United States was able but not willing to serve as the world's hegemon, whereas the UK was still willing but not really able after World War I. So this time period in between is marked by turmoil. And with World War I, you have Germany, Italy, and Japan against the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The interests and the interactions and the institutions in between this time period, the interests are basically do what you can to preserve security through allies, through alliances, try to expand and economic self-sufficiency. So looking inward, economies are not connecting together. The interactions are World War I and II, so lots of war. Beggar thy neighbor policies, where countries are not willing to cooperate with each other and are trying to do what they can to get what they can from each other. And then the institutions, the only one failed. So the League of Nations failed to do very much, and that led to outbreak of another war. So time period number 4 is the Cold War, and this brings us all the way up until the current time period, which is post-Cold War, time period 5. And this map demonstrates in 1980 the Cold War and its alliances. So you've got the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe that are communist one-party systems. They have influence in Europe, and they're building up a coalition. They're doing so through the Warsaw Pact and what they called Comecon at the time. In contrast, the Western Bloc was the United States, Western Europe, and Latin America. Their interests were mainly capitalism and democracy, though, as the chapter points out, the United States was certainly a controversial figure, as we now know, in terms of its support of democratic elections in Latin America, all through covert action. So the United States used covert action to upset a lot of the democratic elections, but democratization processes in Latin America. There was a lot of influence in Europe and a building up of a coalition. And in terms of institutions, you see NATO, and then the Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF, the World Bank, and the soon-to-be WTO, which started out as the GATT. So the Cold War was marked by conflict, crises, and coups. The rise of the Third World, now not an acceptable term, to be clear. Third World was coined during the Cold War, and what we call the non-aligned movement, or NAM. And this movement is the non-Western states. So today that would be Venezuela, Cuba, and other similar states. Cold War phases included these three. So there was intense competition in the early part, and then what we call a détente in the mid-1960s to 1979, with renewed tensions with 1979 to 1991. So to summarize the Cold War, the interests were that the superpowers and allies sought to maximize influence. It was all about controlling the rest of the world. And we'll learn a little bit more about this in the coming weeks. But the United States was focused on containing communism. That was its main foreign policy. The interactions were such that the bipolar structure, where you have two poles, the United States and Soviet Union, it turned more pluralistic, where you have multiple countries that have spheres of influence over their own sets of countries. And then coercive diplomacy slowly started to yield to what we see today with more bargaining. And then in terms of institutions that came out of the Cold War, those that were supported by the United States survived, and the ones that the Soviets supported did not. And the final time period is today. So this picture is the end of the Cold War, or the beginning of the end, with the breakdown of the Berlin Wall. The collapse of the Soviet Union led to more cooperation in the 1991 Gulf War, or the first Gulf War that the United States was involved in. The increased role of the UN increased economic integration, the WTO, but it was marked also by multiple financial crises, and then the rise of what we call the BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. You have economic development shifting from planned economies to the market, and hybrids of communist states and capitalist economies, best exemplified by China, but other states have dabbled with that approach as well. And then there's this economic interdependence where countries have been willing to trade more with each other than ever before. There have been more trade agreements during this time period, so you have an increase in what we call regional trade agreements that explode really after that time period. But we've had lots of crises. So we've got all of these listed, with the United States being involved in many, but not all. We also see the Arab Spring in 2011. And to summarize the post-Cold War era, the interests were that states were increasingly focused on gaining wealth through trade and investment. Security concerns remained prominent. There's more interdependence during this time period, with rising powers challenging the United States and seeking a better voice, or bigger voice, in the UN and other institutions. And with the institutions, you have the UN and global financial and trade institutions becoming more prominent.